wind did not ask for permission to cross the high plains. It tore through the silver-gray buffalo grass, flattening the stalks against the hard earth, and carried the scent of sage and dried mud all the way from the Red River. It was a restless, lonely sound, the kind that could drive a man mad if he did not have enough work to occupy his hands. Nahas sat atop his black Mustang, a statue carved from copper and muscle, listening to the wind. The people of Dust Creek called him the giant Comanche. It was a name born of fear as much as observation. He stood nearly 6 feet and 6 inches, a height that made him tower over the stunted pines and the hunched-over prospectors who drifted through the territory. He shifted his weight, leather creaking against leather. He wore the heavy buckskin leggings of his people, beaded with the patterns of a war party he had led 10 years ago. But his torso was covered by a faded calico shirt and a heavy canvas drover's coat, the kind white men bought at general stores. He was a man straddling a canyon that widened with every passing year. One foot stood in the memory of the buffalo hunts and the open sky, the other in the reality of treaties, fences, and the coin of the United States government. Below him, in the shadow of the canyon walls, his herd of horses grazed. There were 40 heads down there, spotted Appaloosas and sturdy quarter horses. They were his wealth. They were the only thing keeping his small band of families fed through the winter. Nahas urged the black horse forward, descending the rocky trail toward the town that sat like a brown stain on the horizon. Dust Creek. His life was a rhythm of silence and noise. By day, he rode into the noise of the white man's world to trade unbroken colts for sacks of flour, coffee, and ammunition. By night, he returned to the silence of the canyon. It was a heavy silence. He had been a legendary warrior once. Now, the elders whispered that he was too soft, that he allowed the white men to cheat him on the price of grain. The white men, in turn, spat when he walked past, their hands hovering near their pistol grips, wondering when the savage inside him would wake up. Nahas felt the hollowness of his own camp most acutely when the sun went down. He would sit by his fire, tearing at a strip of tough dried meat, watching the smoke curl up toward the stars. There was no woman to grind the corn. There was no soft voice to sing the evening songs. There were no children of his own to chase the fireflies. His lodge was cold, and the work of the ranch was becoming too much for one man to manage alone. He needed to hire help. He planned to break 20 more horses this month. He had arranged for 3 young men from the reservation and 2 drift riders with empty bellies and no questions to help him drive the herd north. He could not ride the herd all day and then return to cook stew for 5 hungry men. Get a woman from the town. The old one, Greystone, had told him, gumming a piece of tobacco. White women will do anything for silver, even cook for us. Nahas had scowled, but he knew the old man was right. 10 miles to the east, the same wind that battered Nahas was threatening to overturn a wagon that had seen better decades. The wagon listed dangerously to the left. The canvas cover was gray with the dust of 3 counties, and the mule pulling it looked as if it were contemplating simply lying down and dying to spite the driver. Martha Odell slapped the reins against the mule's rump. "Get up, you stubborn beast. We are not dying in the middle of nowhere. Not today." Beside her sat Lena. Lena Odell was not a small woman. She was not the delicate, fainting flower that the dime novels praised. She was substantial. Her shoulders were broad, her arms round and solid, and her hips filled the wagon seat completely. She wore a dress made of blue calico that had been patched so many times it was becoming a quilt. Lena clutched the side of the wagon, her knuckles white. She felt every bump in the road reverberate through her body. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. She saw it in the way men's eyes slid over her without stopping, or worse, the way they stopped and narrowed with cruel amusement. Big Lena, they had called her in the last town. Takes 2 horses to carry her. She had learned to make herself small inside, even if she could not be small outside. She had learned that if she kept her head down, worked twice as hard as the thin girls, and scrubbed the floors until her fingers bled, she might be allowed to stay. "Straighten your back, Lena," Martha said, her voice sharp but not unkind. Martha was a wire-thin woman, all gristle and bone, forged in the fires of widowhood and bankruptcy. "We are entering Dust Creek. We need to look employable." "Yes, Mama," Lena said. "Remember," Martha continued, staring ahead at the rising dust of the town. "In this country, you have to be useful. There is no room for useless people. If you are not pretty, you must be strong. If you are not rich, you must be skilled. We have lost the restaurant. We have lost the house. All we have are these pots in our hands." "I know, Mama." Lena knew it down to her marrow. Usefulness was her armor. If she cooked the best stew, if she scrubbed the cleanest shirt, perhaps they would forgive her for taking up so much space. The wagon rattled onto the main street of Dust Creek. It was not much of a town. A single wide dirt road flanked by false-fronted wooden buildings. There was a livery stable, a general store, a blacksmith, and 3 saloons. It smelled of horse manure, stale beer, and desperation. Martha pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store. She climbed down, dusting off her skirt. She reached into the back of the wagon and pulled out a piece of cardboard she had written on earlier that morning with a piece of charcoal. "Cook for hire. Hard workers. Clean habits. Inquire within." She marched to the notice board outside the store and nailed it up right next to a wanted poster for a cattle rustler. Lena stayed in the wagon. She felt the eyes of the town on her. 2 cowboys leaning against the railing of the saloon across the street were watching. One nudged the other. "Look at the size of that heifer," the first one said, loud enough to carry across the street. "That wagon needs a reinforced axle." The other laughed. Lena stared at her hands. They were large hands, red from the wind. She wished she could fold herself into a pocket and disappear. It was at that moment that the light shifted. The sun seemed to be blocked out. Lena looked up. A rider had entered the street. He was magnificent and terrifying. He rode a black horse that stepped high and proud. The man was immense, his shoulders blocking out the sign of the livery stable behind him. His hair was long and black, braided with leather strips, and his face was a landscape of hard plains and deep shadows. A white scar ran from his cheekbone to his jaw. "Giant Comanche," someone whispered on the boardwalk. Nahas ignored them. He rode straight to the general store, dismounting with a grace that belied his size. He tied the black horse to the rail, right next to Odell's miserable mule. He stepped onto the boardwalk, the wood groaning slightly under his boots. He stopped in front of the notice board. Martha was standing there, hammer in hand. She looked up at him. She had to tilt her head back a long way. Most people stepped back from Nahas. Martha Odell did not step back. "You read English?" Martha asked, her voice steady. Nahas looked down at the wiry white woman. "I read—" He looked at the sign, "Cook for hire." Then he looked at the wagon. He saw the pots and pans clattering in the back. And he saw Lena. Their eyes met for a second. Lena felt a jolt of panic. His eyes were dark, like deep water in a well. He did not look at her with the sneer of the cowboys. He looked at her with a measuring gaze, like he was estimating the weight of a sack of grain. It was not kind, but it was not cruel. It was simply factual. He turned back to Martha. "You cook. Best in the territory," Martha said. "My daughter and I, we ran to a place in Abilene before the fire took it. I have a ranch," Nahas said. His voice was a low rumble, like thunder in the next valley. "In the canyon. I have men to feed, no women." A silence rippled through the people standing nearby. Mrs. Hargreaves, the owner of the general store, had come out to sweep the porch. She stopped, her broom suspended. "You want to hire white women, Nahas, Mrs.?" Hargreaves asked, her voice shrill. "To go live in that canyon with your people. My people eat," Nahas said flatly. "I need a cook, not a wife." He looked back at Martha. "The work is hard. The pay is fair, $20 a month, and a roof." $20 was a fortune. It was enough to buy supplies for the winter. It was enough to restart. "We take it," Martha said instantly. "Mama?" Lena whispered from the wagon. She was terrified. To live in a canyon with a Comanche warrior, the stories said they stole women and scalped children. Hush, Lena, Martha said. We have no choice. Wait, a voice slurred from the saloon doorway. A man stumbled out. He was a drifter, known in town as Red Ike. He was drunk, even though it was barely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He had a mean set to his mouth and a pistol hanging low on his hip. You cannot be serious, Martha, Ike shouted, staggering into the street. You gonna let that savage take your girl? Look at her, she is big enough to feed a tribe for a week. The saloon patrons roared with laughter. Lena shrank, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. Nahas turned slowly. He did not reach for the knife at his belt. He simply looked at Red Ike with a weary patience. Go sleep, whiskey man, Nahas said. Don't you tell me what to do. Indian. Ike spat. Just then, a small movement caught Nahas's eye. His nephew, Little Hawk, a boy of 7 years, had slipped away from the trade post down the street. The boy was curious, drawn by the commotion. He stood near the edge of the boardwalk, staring at the white men with wide, dark eyes. Red Ike saw the boy. His face twisted. He needed something to kick, and the giant warrior was too dangerous. Get out of here, you little rat. Ike lunged. He grabbed Little Hawk by his long black hair, jerking the boy backward. The child screamed. Teach you to stare at your betters. Ike raised his hand to strike the boy across the face. Nahas moved. He was fast, but he was 10 paces away. Lena was closer. Something snapped inside Lena Odell. It was the sound of the boy's scream. It was the sound of a helpless thing being hurt by a cruel thing. It was the same sound she heard in her nightmares when she remembered the boys throwing rocks at her because she was slow and heavy. She did not think. She did not weigh the consequences. Lena grabbed the nearest heavy object, a 12-inch cast-iron skillet that sat on the top of their pile of goods. She vaulted from the wagon seat. For a woman of 200 pounds, she moved with the terrifying momentum of a falling boulder. Let him go, she roared. Red Ike turned. Startled by the noise, he saw a wall of blue calico flying at him. Clang! The sound of the skillet connecting with the side of Red Ike's head was sickeningly solid. It rang out like a church bell calling the faithful to prayer. Ike's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled like a wet sack of flour. Dropping Little Hawk, the boy scrambled backward, terrified. Lena stood over the unconscious cowboy, heaving. Her chest rose and fell. She held the skillet raised high, ready to strike again. Her bonnet had fallen back, revealing hair the color of wheat, damp with sweat. Her face was flushed, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that made her look less like a girl and more like a bear defending a cub. She planted herself between the fallen man and the Comanche child. She glared at the men on the saloon porch. Does anyone else want to touch a child? She challenged me. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with adrenaline. The street went dead silent. The wind whistled through the gap between the buildings. Sheriff Briggs stepped out of his office, coffee cup in hand, blinking at the scene. What is tarnation? Nahas had stopped moving. He stood 5 feet away. He looked at the cowboy lying in the dirt. Then he looked at the skillet. And finally, he looked at Lena. He had seen white women scream. He had seen them faint. He had seen them shoot guns with eyes closed. He had never seen a white woman, especially one who looked soft as rising doe, move with the fury of a mountain lion. The contempt that usually lined his thoughts when he looked at the townspeople vanished. He walked over to Little Hawk. The boy ran to his uncle's leg, burying his face in the buckskin. Nahas placed a large hand on the boy's head, but his eyes never left Lena. Lena realized what she had done. She lowered the skillet. Her hands began to tremble. She looked at the unconscious man, then at the giant Comanche towering over her. She felt the familiar shame rising. She had made a spectacle of herself again. She was too loud, too violent, too much. I didn't mean to, she stammered. Retreating toward the wagon, Nahas stepped forward. The shadow of him fell over her, blocking out the harsh sun. You have a good arm, Nahas said. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact. He turned to Martha. who was staring at her daughter with her mouth slightly open. $25, Nahas said. Martha blinked. What? $25 a month, Nahas repeated. He looked back at Lena, who was clutching the frying pan to her chest like a shield. And you bring the skillet? He scooped Little Hawk up with one arm, effortlessly lifting the boy to his hip. He walked back to his black horse, leaving the town of Dust Creek in stunned silence. Lena stood there, the iron handle biting into her palm. For the first time in her life, a man had looked at her strength and offered it a price, rather than an insult. Get in the wagon, Lena, Martha said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange, new hope. We have a job. Lena climbed back up. The wood creaked, but this time, as she looked at the back of the giant warrior riding away toward the canyon, she did not feel quite as heavy. The wind picked up again, swirling the dust around the fallen body of Red Ike, but the story of the giant Comanche and the cook had already begun. The dust from the street had barely settled around the form of the unconscious cowboy when the reality of the arrangement began to set in. The adrenaline that had propelled Lena Odell out of the wagon was fading, replaced by the cold, prickly sensation of 100 eyes boring into her back. She clutched the iron skillet to her chest, her knuckles white, feeling as exposed as a plucked chicken. Nahas stood by his horse, the black stallion stamping a hoof impatiently. He looked at the mother and daughter, his face a mask of copper and stone. He did not smile. He did not offer comfort. He offered only terms. My name is Nahas, he said, his voice carrying over the low murmurs of the crowd. The people of this town call me other things. You will call me Nahas. Martha Odell straightened her spine. She was a woman who had looked poverty in the eye and refused to blink. So she would not blink at a Comanche warrior either. I am Martha. This is my daughter, Lena. The camp is 3 hours' ride, Nahas stated, ignoring the whispers rippling from the saloon porch. The canyon is deep. The nights are cold. My people live there. Some of them remember the wars. Some of them do not like white faces. He paused, his dark eyes flicking to the red mark on Lena's palm where she gripped the handle of the pan. But they respect strength, and they are hungry. He turned toward the general store. Buy your supplies. We ride before the sun touches the western ridge. As Nahas strode into the store to settle his own trade, the town of Dust Creek seemed to exhale the breath it had been holding. Then, the gossip began. It started low, like the buzzing of horseflies, and grew louder. Mrs. Hargreaves, who owned the mercantile and considered herself the moral compass of the county, leaned her broom against the wall and crossed her arms. She watched Martha and Lena climb back onto their wagon to move it toward the loading dock. Did you hear that? Mrs. Hargreaves hissed to a woman standing nearby. 2 white women, going out to the canyon. And that girl, well, she is hardly a delicate thing. But still, a merchant in a dusty bowler hat laughed. A sharp, unpleasant sound. Maybe the giant Comanche is tired of sleeping alone on the hard ground. I want to set up a proper household, though he will need a reinforced bed frame for that one. Lena heard them. The words were not meant to be private. They were meant to wound. She kept her head down, focusing on the fraying leather of the reins in her hands. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks, a burning shame that had nothing to do with the sun. She was 22 years old, and she had learned that her size made her a target for every small-minded soul with a tongue. Martha ignored them, though her lips pressed into a thin, white line. She guided the mule to the back of the store, away from the prying eyes of the street. She tied off the reins and signaled for Lena to wait. Stay here, Martha said firmly. I need to settle the terms. A man does not buy a horse without checking the teeth, and a woman does not take a job without knowing the sleeping arrangements. Martha marched into the back of the store. It was a dim, dusty space smelling of dried tobacco and vinegar. Nahas was there, lifting a heavy sack of coffee as if it were filled with feathers. He turned as Martha entered. The space was small, and his presence filled it. He was overwhelmingly large. his shoulders seeming to brush the shelves on either side. "We have a deal," Martha began, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. $25, room and board, but I need to be clear on one thing. Mr. Nahas." Nahas waited, his face impassive. Martha took a breath. She thought of Lena outside, bruised by the town's words, innocent despite her strength. "You are a man living alone. You are hiring 2 women. Are you hiring a cook, or are you looking for comforts?" It was a dangerous question to ask a man who carried a knife the size of a forearm, but Martha Odell would rather be struck down than lead her daughter into a trap. Nahas dropped the sack of coffee onto the counter. The thud echoed in the quiet room. He looked at Martha, and for a moment, his eyes narrowed. Then, he looked past her, through the open loading door where Lena sat on the wagon seat. Staring at the horizon, he saw the curve of her back, the heavy plait of wheat-colored hair, the solidity of her form against the fragile wood of the wagon. He saw a woman who had swung iron to protect a child, not her own. "I have horses to break," Nahas said, his voice dropping to a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I have fences to mend. I have a peace treaty that hangs by a thread to maintain. I do not have time for games, and I do not have room in my bed." He walked closer to Martha, towering over her. "I hired you and your daughter only to cook. I hired you to wash the dust from the clothes and keep the fire burning. I did not hire you to warm the blankets of any man in my camp. Not mine, not the hands." He looked back at Lena one more time. The denial was firm, spoken with the absolute certainty of a man who controlled his world. Yet, as his gaze lingered on the slope of her shoulder, a strange tension tightened in his chest. It was a physical sensation, a sudden awareness of space and heat that he had not felt in years. He crushed the feeling instantly, extinguishing it like a spark under a boot heel. He was a warrior, not a fool. She was a white woman, and she was merely a tool to keep his ranch functioning. "If any man touches her," Nahas added, his voice dropping an octave, "he answers to me, and I do not answer with words." Martha let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Good. Then we understand each other." The journey to the canyon was a passage from one world into another. They left the town of Dust Creek behind, abandoning the grid of streets and false fronts for the open, rolling expanse of the territory. Nahas rode ahead on his black Mustang, a silent vanguard. The Odell wagon rattled behind, the mule complaining at every incline. As the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, the terrain changed. The flat plains gave way to jagged rocks and scrub oak. They entered the mouth of a canyon, the stone walls rising up on either side like the ribs of a giant beast. Lena sat rigid on the wagon seat. She felt the atmosphere shift. The air here smelled different, cleaner, sharper. Carrying the scent of pine resin and wood smoke, they rounded a bend, and the camp revealed itself. It was not a town, and it was not quite a ranch. It was a cluster of contradictions. To the left, sturdy wooden corrals held a herd of horses that moved like restless water. To the right, 5 buffalo-hide teepees stood in a semicircle, smoke drifting lazily from their tops. In the center stood a rough-hewn log cabin, unfinished but solid, and a large, open fire pit. People emerged from the teepees as the procession arrived. Women with dark braids and vibrant blankets wrapped around their shoulders stopped their work to watch. Children, half naked and brown as nuts, paused in their games. Lena felt the weight of their gazes. These were not the sneering looks of the townspeople. These were looks of intense curiosity and guarded suspicion. She felt enormous, beside the lithe, compact bodies of the Comanche women. She felt like a lumbering giantess. She felt too white, her skin blazing like a beacon against the red earth and copper skin of the inhabitants. She pulled her shawl tighter, trying to shrink, but there was nowhere to hide. She was a mountain of a woman in a valley of lean hunters. Nahas dismounted near the log cabin. He signaled to a young man who ran forward to take the reins of the black horse. "This is the house," Nahas said, gesturing to the cabin. It has a roof. It has a stove. It has not been used since the winter. He led them inside. The cabin was a single large room with a loft. It was cold, smelling of damp wood and neglect. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, cold and rusted. A table with one uneven leg stood in the center. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softness of any kind. It was a place where a man slept and ate, nothing more. The kitchen is there. Nahas pointed to a lean-to addition at the back. There is wood in the pile, water in the creek. We eat when the stars are out. With that, he turned and left them, the heavy door shutting with a finality that made Lena jump. That first night, the darkness in the canyon was absolute. The walls of rock blocked out the moon, leaving only the spray of stars overhead. Lena worked. It was the only thing she knew how to do that pushed back the fear. She scrubbed the rust from the stove with sand and grease. She chopped the onions they had bought in town. She mixed the cornmeal with water and salt. Outside, the rhythm of the camp changed. A drum began to beat a slow, steady thrumming that seemed to match the pulse of the earth. A voice rose in a chant, high and mournful. Lena froze, her hands deep in the dough. In the stories she had heard as a child, that sound meant death. It meant the raid was coming. "Just keep kneading, Lena," Martha said from the corner where she was sweeping cobwebs. Her mother's voice was tight, but steady. "It is just a song. Dough does not rise with fear." Lena forced her hands to move, and as she worked, she listened. The chant was not angry. It was sad. It was lonely. It drifted through the cracks in the logs and wrapped around her. Strangely, the fear began to recede. For the first time in her life, she was in a place where no one was telling her she took up too much room. The darkness was big enough for her. The canyon was wide enough. The music did not care about the size of her waist. A peculiar sense of peace settled over her, as unexpected as rain in August. 50 yards away, Nahas stood in the shadow of his own lodge. He did not go inside. He stood with his arms crossed, feeling the night air on his face. Usually, this was the time of the hollow silence, the time when he felt the ghost of his old life pressing against his ribs. But tonight, the air was different. It carried a scent, the smell of onions sizzling in hot grease, the heavy, warm aroma of cornbread baking, the scent of sage being burned, not for ceremony, but to clear the air of a dusty room. He heard the clatter of a metal spoon against a bowl. He heard the low murmur of two women speaking not the harsh, demanding tones of traders, but the soft, weaving cadence of a family. Nahas closed his eyes and inhaled. His stomach growled, a deep, animal sound, but it was more than hunger. For the first time in 3 years, since the last of his family had died or moved to the reservation, the camp did not feel like a holding pen for ghosts. It felt terrifyingly like a house. He resented the feeling. He pushed it away. He had hired labor, he reminded himself. He had not hired a house. While the canyon settled into its uneasy truce, 20 miles away in the main house of the Double Bar K Ranch, a different kind of fire was burning. Silas Kane sat behind a mahogany desk that had been shipped all the way from St. Louis. He was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. His suit was tailored gray wool, his vest was silk, and his eyes were the color of pale, watered-down whiskey. Across from him sat Sheriff Briggs, a man whose badge was polished but whose conscience was tarnished. Silas Kane poured a glass of amber liquid and slid it across the desk. He did not offer a toast. "You let him ride out of town?" "Briggs," Kane said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. "You let the savage ride out of town with 2 white women. He broke no laws." "Mr. Kane," the sheriff mumbled, taking the drink. "He hired them." Martha Odell was looking for work. They went willingly. Kane stood up and walked to the window. He looked out over his cattle, thousands of them, grazing on land that he had ruthlessly acquired over the last decade. But his eyes looked past them, toward the jagged line of the canyon in the west. "That valley," Kane said softly, "has the best water in the territory. It stays wet even in the drought, And that Comanche is squatting on it with a piece of paper from a government that doesn't understand the value of grazing land. He turned back to the sheriff. I have been trying to get the governor to declare that land open range for years. They say Nahas is civilized. They say he keeps the peace. Cain took a sip of his own drink, a cruel smile touching his lips. But now he has taken 2 white women into a camp full of bucks, a widow and a young girl. They are cooks, Silas, the sheriff argued weakly. And that girl, she is big enough to defend herself. She knocked Red Ike cold with a skillet. It does not matter what they are, Cain snapped. It matters what we can say they are. A savage holding white women, that is a powder keg. Sheriff, and I intend to light the match. He sat back down. His fingers steepled. If Nahas is busy defending himself against accusations of kidnapping and moral depravity, he will make a mistake. And when he makes a mistake, I will be there to take that valley. Leave them be for now, Cain ordered. Let the town talk. Let the gossip fester like a rot. When the time is right, we will go up there and rescue them. And if the Comanche fights back, well, self-defense is a powerful legal argument. Back in Dust Creek, the gossip was indeed festering. In the saloon, the story of the skillet had already changed. Now, people whispered that Nahas had bewitched the women. They whispered that the fat girl was his concubine, that he had taken her because no white man would have her. The wind blew through the streets, carrying the poison of their words out toward the canyon, where a woman was baking bread and a warrior was trying to ignore the feeling that his world was shifting under his feet. The seeds of conflict had been sown in the hard, dry earth, and they would grow watered by prejudice and greed. The weeks that followed the arrival of the Odell women in the canyon settled into a rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of the land itself. The sun would crest the eastern ridge, painting the red rock walls in shades of bruised purple and burning gold, and the camp would wake to the sound of an axe splitting wood. It was not the sharp, quick strike of a man's hand, but a heavier, rhythmic thud that echoed off the stone. Lena Odell started her mornings before the dew had evaporated from the sagebrush. While Martha was inside the cabin, her knuckles deep in a mound of flour and water, Lena was outside, swinging the heavy iron axe with a grace that defied her size. She split logs of mesquite and oak as if they were kindling, her breath clouding in the chill air, her face flushed with exertion. Nahas would watch her from the corral. He was usually breaking the colts at that hour, his body moving in a violent dance with 1,000 pounds of frightened muscle. But in the quiet moments between the bucking and the rearing, his eyes would drift to the cabin. He saw a woman who did not complain. He saw a woman who carried 2 buckets of water from the creek, one in each hand, without spilling a drop, the muscles in her thick arms cording under the pale skin. The hired hands. 2 white drifters named Silas and Pete, who had joined the camp for the season, had initially snickered at the big cook. They stopped laughing the day the wheel of the supply wagon stuck fast in a mud rut near the creek crossing. Pete had been cursing and whipping the mule, trying to dislodge the heavy vehicle. Nahas had started walking over to assist, but Lena was closer. She had waded into the mud, the muck rising past her ankles, ruining the hem of her dress. She did not shout or fuss. She simply placed her shoulder under the rear axle, planted her feet, and heaved. The wagon groaned. The wood creaked in protest. Lena's face turned a deep shade of crimson, her jaw set like granite, with a guttural sound of effort. She lifted the corner of the wagon just enough for the wheel to clear the suction of the mud. "Drive!" she yelled at the stunned Pete. The mule pulled, and the wagon rolled free. Lena stood in the mud, wiping her hands on her apron, breathing hard. When she looked up, she found the entire camp watching her. The Comanche warriors, usually impassive, were murmuring to one another. Strength was the only currency that held universal value in the territory, and Lena Odell had just proved she was rich in it. Nahas had nodded to her. A single, sharp inclination of his head. It was the highest praise he could offer. By noon, the smell of the camp would change. For years, the air had smelled only of horse sweat, burning dung, and dried meat. Now, it smelled of yeast and caramelized onions. It smelled of rosemary and thyme, herbs that Martha had coaxed from the dry earth in a small garden patch she had started behind the cabin. Lunch was a strange affair, where two worlds collided over tin plates. Nahas insisted that everyone eat. The three young Comanche warriors who helped with the herd Little Wolf, Runs with Wind, and Spotted Horse would sit on one side of the fire, cross-legged and wary. The White Hands would sit on logs on the other side. Lena would serve the stew from a cauldron that looked large enough to boil a whole calf. It was a rich, thick broth made from venison, potatoes, and wild carrots, accompanied by flatbread that was a marriage between the dense cornbread of the South and the fry bread of the plains. At first, Little Wolf had refused to touch it, claiming that white women's cooking would make a warrior weak. But hunger is a persuasive debater. One day, the smell of roasted garlic was too much. Little Wolf took a bite. He chewed slowly, his expression fierce, daring anyone to comment. Then he took another bite. By the end of the week, he was leaving the finest cuts of fresh game on the step of the kitchen lean-to as a silent offering to the cook. It was in the late afternoon of the third week that the silence between Nahas and Lena began to shift. Nahas had finished his work early and was walking past the open side of the kitchen lean-to. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt floor. Lena was there, her back to him, shaping loaves of bread for the evening meal. She was humming. It was a low, mournful tune, drifting on the wind. Nahas stopped. His boots froze in the dust. The melody was familiar, painfully so. It was not a hymn from the Baptist churches of the town. It was a song he had not heard in 20 years, not since his mother had rocked his younger sister by the fire. It was a Comanche lullaby. But the phrasing was slightly wrong, the rhythm altered by a tongue not born to the language. He stepped into the shadow of the lean-to. "Where did you learn that song?" Lena jumped, dropping a ball of dough. She spun around, her eyes wide, wiping floury hands on her apron. Nahas stood in the doorway, blocking out the light. He looked immense, his presence filling the small space. I am sorry," she stammered. "I did not mean to disturb you. I was just passing the time." "The song," Nahas repeated, his voice low but urgent. "It is a song of the people, a song for sleeping. Where did a white woman hear it?" Lena looked down at her hands. She seemed to shrink slightly, a habit she could not break despite her size. "When I was a girl," she said softly. "We lived near the border of the territory. My father was gone often. One winter, a small band of your people came through. They were starving. I think they camped near our barn for 2 nights. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were the color of the sky after a rainstorm, clear and honest. "There was an old woman. She sat by their fire. I was afraid of her, but she beckoned me over. She was holding a sick baby. She sang that song to it, over and over, for hours. The melody. It got stuck in my head. It made me feel safe, even though I did not understand the words. I have hummed it ever since when I was lonely." Nahas stared at her. He looked for a lie in her face, but found none. "The words," Nahas said, stepping closer, his voice softening. "Say that the hawk sleeps in the high rock, and the wind sleeps in the grass, so the child must sleep in the heart of the mother." Lena smiled, a small, tentative thing. "That is beautiful. I always thought it was about the rain." "It is about safety," Nahas corrected. He looked at the flower on her cheek, the sweat on her brow, the capability in her large hands. "You have a good memory, Lena Odell, to keep a song for so long." "I keep the things that are kind," she said simply. "There have not been so many of them that I can afford to lose one." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy and true. Nahas felt a strange tightening in his chest. He wanted to say something more, to bridge the distance between them, but the words felt dangerous. He nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked away. But that night, as he sat by his own fire, he found himself humming the same tune, realizing that for the first time in years, the camp did not feel quite so empty. From the window of the cabin, Martha watched the exchange. She saw the way the giant warrior leaned in to hear her daughter speak. She saw the way his eyes lingered on Lena, not with the hungry look of a man wanting flesh, but with the confused look of a man discovering water in a desert. Martha wiped a plate with a rag. Her brow furrowed. She was grateful for the food in the larder and the roof over their heads. Nahas was a man of his word. He had been respectful and fair, but she knew the world they lived in. She knew that a spark struck in dry grass could burn down a whole prairie. "Be careful, my girl," she whispered to the glass pane. "Do not let your heart get too big for this valley. The world outside will not forgive you for it." Nahas struggled with his own ghosts. The nights were the hardest. He would sit wrapped in his buffalo robe, listening to the coyotes call from the ridges. He thought of his brothers who had died fighting the Texas Rangers. He thought of the treaties that had been signed and broken like dry twigs. Was he betraying them by filling his camp with the smell of white bread, by letting a white woman hum the songs of his ancestors, the young ones talk? Greystone, the oldest member of the small enclave, said one evening, sitting by Nahas's fire. The old man's face was a map of wrinkles, his eyes clouded with cataracts. "Let them talk," Nahas grunted, poking the embers with a stick. "Talk does not break horses." "They say you are building a white man's ranch," Greystone said. "They say you have forgotten the old ways. The old ways are gone." "Uncle," Nahas said bitterly, "the buffalo are gone. If we do not build a ranch, if we do not sell horses to the army and the settlers, we starve." "Do they want to eat pride, or do they want to eat venison stew?" Greystone chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The stew is good. The big woman knows how to cook. A full belly makes a man less angry." "Nahas, but it also makes him sleepy. Watch that you do not fall asleep while the wolves are circling." The wolves were indeed circling, though they walked on two legs and wore silk vests. Silas Kane was not a man who accepted obstacles. When he wanted a valley, he took it. When a Comanche horse breeder stood in his way, he removed him. He started with economics. He sent riders to intercept the army buyers who usually purchased mounts from Nahas. He spread rumors that the Comanche horses were diseased, that they were carrying glanders. When Nahas rode to the fort with 10 prime colts, the quartermaster turned him away. "Sorry, Nahas. Orders from up top. We are buying from the Double Bar K this season." Nahas had ridden back to the canyon in a cold fury, the unsold horses trailing behind him. He knew whose hand was on the reins. Silas Kane was trying to starve him out. Then came the darker whispers. In the saloons of Dust Creek, men paid by Kane began to tell stories over their whiskey. "Have you heard about the giant Comanche?" one would say. "Got himself a harem up there in the canyon. I heard he is holding those Odell women against their will," another would lie. "Keeping them as slaves. Shameful, is what it is." Sheriff Briggs heard the talk. He rode out to the Double Bar K to speak with Kane. "You are pushing it, Silas," the sheriff warned, standing in Kane's opulent study. "If you stir up a panic about white captives, the cavalry will come down from Fort Griffin. They will not just burn out Nahas, they will put this whole county under martial law. That is bad for business." Kane smiled, cutting the tip off a cigar. "Let them come. Once Nahas are dead or in chains, the valley is open range. And if a few women get rescued in the process, well, the town will call us heroes." The pressure mounted until it became necessary to go to town for supplies that could not be bartered. The winter was coming, and they needed salt, sugar, and cloth. Nahas hitched the team to the wagon. "I'm going to Dust Creek," he announced. "I will come with you," Lena said, stepping out of the cabin. She wore her best dress, though it was faded, and a bonnet that hid her face. "We need needles and thread, and the flour is low." Nahas hesitated. He knew what the town was saying. He wanted to tell her to stay, to hide her away in the safety of the canyon walls, but he saw the set of her chin. She was not a woman who hid. "Get in," he said. The ride to Dust Creek was silent. The tension radiated from Nahas like heat from a stove. When they arrived, the atmosphere in the town was different than before. It was not just curiosity now, it was hostility. Men stopped on the boardwalk to stare. Women pulled their children closer. Nahas parked the wagon in front of the mercantile. He helped Lena down. His hand lingered on her elbow for a second longer than necessary, a silent promise of protection. They entered the store. Mrs. Hargreaves was behind the counter, weighing nails for a customer. She stopped when she saw them. The conversation in the shop died instantly. Lena walked to the fabric section, her head high. She could feel the eyes on her back. She could hear the intake of breath. 2 women were standing near the ribbon display. They did not lower their voices. "That is her," one whispered, though it sounded like a shout in the quiet room. "The one who lives with the savage. Look at the size of her." The other sneered. "I suppose when you look like that, you cannot be choosy. No white man would have her. She had to go to the blanket to find a husband." "Husband?" The first laughed cruelly. "I doubt he married her. Probably just uses her to carry his wood. Like a mule." Lena froze. Her hand hovered over a spool of blue ribbon. The words cut deeper than any knife. They confirmed her darkest fears that she was unlovable, that she was grotesque, that her only value was her labor. Nahas was standing by the counter, ordering salt. He heard every word, his hands, resting on the wooden countertop, clenched into fists. The knuckles turned white. The veins in his forearms bulged like cords of steel. A low growl started deep in his throat, a sound so primal that Mrs. Hargreaves took a step back in genuine terror. He turned slowly. His eyes were black fire. He looked at the 2 women. They gasped and clutched each other, suddenly terrified of the giant they had provoked. Nahas took a step toward them. The floorboards groaned. "Nahas!" Lena's voice cut through the red haze of his anger. He stopped. He looked at her. She was pale, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but she shook her head slightly. "Do not," her eyes pleaded. "Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing the savage they expect." Nahas breathed in through his nose, a sharp, whistling sound. He forced his hands to unclench. He turned back to the counter, threw $3 silver down, more than the cost of the salt, and grabbed the sack. "We are done here," he said, his voice like grinding stones. He marched to Lena, placed a hand gently but firmly on her back, and guided her out of the store, leaving the terrified women and the stunned shopkeeper in their wake. They rode out of town at a fast trot. Nahas did not slow the horses until the buildings of Dust Creek were swallowed by the dust behind them. He was shaking with rage. He wanted to turn back and burn the town to the ground. He wanted to scream that this woman was worth 10 of them, that she had more honor in her little finger than they had in their entire hollow lives. Lena sat beside him, staring at the horizon. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears did not wash away insults. "I am sorry," Nahas said finally, the words feeling inadequate in his mouth. "I should not have brought you. It is not your fault," Lena said quietly. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "They have always said things. Before you, it was just that I was fat. Now, it is that I am fat, and yours." She looked up at him, and a sad smile touched her lips. "At least in your canyon, the wind is loud enough to drown them out. At least in your lodge, there is no laughter." Nahas pulled on the reins, slowing the horses to a walk. He turned to look at her. The sun was setting behind her, framing her in a halo of light. He saw the pain in her eyes, but also the incredible resilience that kept her upright. "Lena," he said, using her name like a vow. "In my lodge, the wind brings the smell of the smoke and the bread you bake. It does not bring the voices of strangers. You are safe there." He did not realize the implication of his words until they were spoken. He had claimed her. He had placed her inside the circle of his protection, not as a servant, but as something else, something precious. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me," he said roughly, turning his eyes back to the road. "Just sing that song again, the one about the hawk." Lena began to hum. The melody rose softly into the twilight, weaving around them, binding the Comanche warrior and the outcast woman together against the encroaching dark. And for the rest of the ride home, The silence was not empty at all. The wire had been cut. It was not a break caused by a panicked steer or the wear of rust and time. It was a clean, deliberate severing, the bright metal shining like a fresh wound against the rusted iron. Nahas sat on his horse, staring at the gap in the fencing he had labored over for 3 months. 5 of his best mares were gone, vanished into the labyrinth of canyons to the south. The tracks of shod horses' riders who knew the terrain mingled with the unshod prints of his herd. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He ran a thumb over the cut wire. This was not just theft. It was an insult. It was a message from the Double Bar K ranch, written in steel and silence. "They say the Comanche cannot hold its own fences," Little Wolf said, riding up beside him. The young warrior's face was dark with humiliation. "They say the giant has gone soft living with the white women." Nahas looked up, his eyes narrowing. "They say many things, but they do not say them to my face. Silas Kane does not need to speak to your face when he can cut your throat from behind." Little Wolf spat. Nahas swung back into the saddle. The anger in his chest was a cold, heavy stone. "Fix the fence. I rode to town." In Dust Creek, the atmosphere was thick with the impending change of seasons. The air was heavy and still, the kind of weather that makes dogs snap at flies and men drink too much whiskey before noon. Martha Odell was loading sacks of cornmeal into the back of the wagon when a shadow fell over her. She turned to find Silas Kane standing there, twirling a silver-tipped cane. He looked out of place in the dusty street, clean and predatory. "Mrs. Odell," Kane said, tipping his hat. "You are looking weary." "I am working, Mr. Kane," Martha said, hoisting a sack with a grunt. "Work makes a person tired. It is an honest feeling. It is a hard life for a widow and a daughter out there in that canyon," Kane said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Living among savages, unprotected." "We are protected fine," Martha replied sharply. "Nahas treats us with respect, which is more than I can say for some Christian men in this town." Kane's smile did not falter, but his eyes grew cold. "I am offering you a way out. Martha, before things get complicated, I have a position open at the main house. Cooking for my hands. A warm room. No risk of being scalped in your sleep." He leaned in closer, his cologne smelling of lavender and rot. "Nahas is a relic. He is holding on to land that belongs to progress. When the storm comes, and it is coming, you do not want to be standing next to the lightning rod. Take your girl and leave the valley." Martha stared at him. She saw the threat behind the offer. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her hands trembling slightly. "We have a contract, Mr. Kane. We do not break our word. Contracts with Indians are written on water. Madam," Kane called after her as she snapped the reins. "Remember, I gave you a chance." Back at the camp, the tension was palpable. Martha recounted the conversation while she and Lena peeled potatoes in the lean-to. "He means trouble." "Lena," Martha said, her knife slipping on a potato skin. "Silas Kane is a man who burns down the barn to kill a rat. Maybe we should go. Maybe we are just making it harder for Nahas." Lena stopped working. She looked out at the corral where Nahas was gentling a nervous colt. "Go where? Mama back to the town where they moo like cows when I walk by. Back to sleeping in the wagon." "To safety?" Martha pleaded. "There is no safety for us out there," Lena said, her voice surprisingly firm. She looked down at her body, at the sturdy arms that could lift a sack of flour as easily as a child. "Here, I am useful. Nahas does not look at me like I am a mistake. He looks at me like I am necessary." She picked up the knife again. "I am not leaving." The decision was made, but the skies seemed to disagree. By mid-afternoon, the strange stillness in the air broke. The wind shifted violently, coming from the north, carrying the taste of copper and grit. "Storm!" Little Wolf shouted from the ridge. It was a dust storm, a brown wall of earth moving across the plains, swallowing the sun. The light turned an eerie, bruised yellow. Nahas was in the main corral, trying to secure the gate. The horses were screaming, their eyes rolling white with instinctual panic. They could smell the electricity in the air. Then came the sound, not thunder, but the sharp, cracking report of repeating rifles. Crack, crack, crack! Silas Kane's men. They were not shooting to kill. They were shooting to terrify. They were firing into the air from the ridge above the box canyon, driving the herd into a frenzy. Stampede! Nahas roared. The herd of 40 horses, terrified by the wind and the gunfire, turned as one. They surged toward the only opening the gap between the corral and the cabin. The ground shook. The noise was deafening. A roar of hooves that vibrated in the teeth. Lena was in the yard, gathering the laundry from the line before the dust hit. She looked up and saw the brown tide of muscle and terror rushing toward her. She dropped the basket. Her instinct screamed at her to run for the cabin door. Then she saw him. Little Hawk, the 7-year-old nephew of Nahas, had tripped over a root near the woodpile. He was frozen, staring up at the wall of horses thundering down upon him. He was directly in the path. Nahas was too far away. He was sprinting from the corral, shouting, but he could not reach the boy in time. Lena did not think. She did not calculate the odds. She moved. For 20 years, Lena Odell had been told she was too big. She had been told she took up too much space. Now, in the swirling dust and roaring noise, she threw that size against death itself. She did not run away from the danger. She ran into it. She launched herself across the yard, moving with a momentum that shook the earth. She reached Little Hawk a second before the lead stallion. She did not try to carry him away. There was no time. Instead, she grabbed the boy and threw herself to the ground, curling her large body around his small one. She became a mountain. She became a shield of flesh and bone. She tucked her head down, exposing her broad back to the hooves. "Lena!" Nahas screamed. The herd split. Horses are not mindless. They will try to avoid a solid obstacle if they can see it. And Lena was a solid obstacle. The lead stallion swerved, his flank brushing her shoulder hard enough to bruise bone. The rest of the herd flowed around her like water around a boulder. Hooves struck the earth inches from her face. Dust choked her. She felt a hoof clip her hip, a sharp explosion of pain, but she did not uncurl. She held the boy tighter, her body absorbing the shocks, the dirt, the terror. Nahas reached them as the tail end of the herd galloped past. He threw himself over both of them, adding his own body to the shield, though the danger was mostly over. They lay there in a pile in the dirt, the giant warrior, the large woman, and the small boy, while the dust storm howled around them, burying them in a layer of red grit. The storm broke as quickly as it had arrived, giving way to a torrential downpour. The sky opened up, washing the dust from the air and turning the ground to slick red mud. Nahas pulled Lena up. She was covered in mud and dirt, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair a wild tangle of wet wheat. Little Hawk was crying, clinging to her leg. "Are you broken?" Nahas asked. His voice was rough, shaking with the adrenaline crash. He ran his hands over her arms, checking for fractures. I am solid," Lena gasped, wiping mud from her eyes. She winced as she put weight on her left leg. The rain was freezing, a sudden drop in temperature typical of the high desert. The cabin was 50 yards away, but the path was now a river of mud. "The cave," Nahas ordered. There was a shallow overhang in the canyon wall, closer to where they stood. Used to store dry wood. He scooped up Little Hawk in one arm and grabbed Lena's arm with the other, half carrying, half guiding her to the shelter. They collapsed into the dry, shallow cave. It was small, intimate. The rain fell in a curtain in front of them, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Little Hawk, exhausted by the terror, curled up on a pile of buffalo robes stored in the corner and fell instantly into the sleep of shock. Nahas and Lena sat against the stone wall, shivering. They were soaked to the bone. The cold of the high plains was dangerous when wet. Lena's teeth began to chatter. She hugged her arms around herself, conscious of how her wet dress clung to her rolls, to the heavy curve of her breasts and hips. She felt grotesque, a wet, muddy mountain. Nahas saw the shivers racking her body. He did not hesitate. He unclasped his heavy buffalo hide cloak, which had stayed mostly dry on the inside. and swung it around her shoulders. He did not stop there. He moved closer, sliding his arm around her waist, pulling her bodily against him. "Share the heat," he commanded softly. Lena stiffened. "Nahas, Hush, you will freeze." He pulled her back against his chest. He was a furnace. The heat radiating from him was intense. Lena felt herself melting into him. For the first time, she felt her size was not a burden, but something that fit. Her back against his broad chest, her hips against his thighs. They were two large people, two giants in a world of small things, fitting together like puzzle pieces. The silence in the cave was filled only by the drumming of the rain and the sound of their breathing. Nahas looked down at the woman in his arms. He smelled the rain on her skin, the scent of sage and dough. He felt the softness of her, a stark contrast to the hard edges of his life. His heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythm that had nothing to do with the stampede. He shifted, his face inches from her neck, the impulse to bury his face in the curve of her shoulder, to taste the rain on her skin, was overwhelming. It was a hunger sharper than any he had known. Lena turned her head. Their faces were so close she could feel his breath on her lips. Her eyes were wide, vulnerable, asking a question she was afraid to voice. The air between them crackled with a raw, undeniable attraction. It was sexy in its intensity, in the awareness of heavy, wet fabric and warm flesh. Nahas's hand moved up her arm, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He saw the desire in her eyes, and it terrified him more than the stampede. He pulled back abruptly. The loss of contact was a physical blow. He cleared his throat, his voice rasping. I did not hire you for this. Lena Odell." He pulled the cloak tighter around her, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second too long before retreating. "I hired you to cook, not to freeze to death." He stood up and moved to the mouth of the cave, staring out at the rain, his back rigid. He was fighting a war inside his own skin. Lena sat wrapped in his scent and his warmth, staring at his broad back. She touched her lips where his breath had been. He had rejected her, but he had done it with a gentleness that broke her heart. That night, the rain stopped, leaving the canyon washed clean and silent. But there was no peace in the cabin. Lena lay in her loft bed, listening to Martha's steady breathing below. She could not sleep. Her hip throbbed where the horse had struck her, but the ache in her chest was worse. She replayed the moment in the cave over and over. She remembered the heat of him, and she remembered the way he had pulled away. "He did not hire you for this." The words twisted in her mind. Of course he didn't. Who would hire her for that? She was Big Lena. She was the girl boys made bets about. She was the one they used for heavy lifting, not for loving. She stared at the rough timber of the ceiling. She was terrified that she had misread him. Or worse, that she hadn't misread him, but that his disgust at her body was stronger than his moment of weakness. She feared that if she let herself want him, she would be discarded like a broken tool. Outside, by the embers of the fire, Nahas sat with Greystone. "You are walking on the edge of a cliff." "Nahas," the old man said, smoking his pipe. "The white woman, she has a strong spirit. She threw herself under the hooves for the boy. That is a warrior's act." "She is brave," Nahas admitted, staring into the coals. "Brave is good, but she is white, and she is a woman." Greystone looked at Nahas. "A warrior does not take a white woman into his heart without paying a price. The tribe will not understand. The white world will not forgive. There is no path for you two that does not lead to blood." "I know," Nahas said softly. "I know the laws." "Do you?" Greystone asked. "Or do you only know the smell of her hair?" Nahas did not answer. He could still feel the phantom weight of her against his chest. The next morning, the damage from the stampede had to be assessed. The fence was broken in 3 places. 2 horses had broken their legs in the panic and had to be put down. It was a grim task that left Nahas silent and dark-eyed. Silas Kane was not done. While Nahas was burying the horses, Kane was sitting in the sheriff's office in Dust Creek. "It is worse than we thought. Briggs," Kane said. his voice grave. "My men saw it from the ridge. There was shooting. The Indians were rioting. The horses were running wild." "Rioting," Sheriff Briggs frowned. "Or was someone shooting at them?" "Does it matter?" Kane slammed his hand on the desk. "It is chaos up there. And in the middle of it are two defenseless white women. We cannot let this stand. We have a moral duty. Sheriff, you need to organize a posse. We need to go up there and rescue those women from that squalor. And if Nahas resists—" Kane shrugged. "Then he is a hostile captive. And the land?" Briggs asked wearily. "Once the hostile is removed, the land reverts to the public domain." Kane smiled. "And I will be first in line to file a claim." Back at the canyon, Lena and Martha were cleaning the mud from the cabin. The storm had blown the door open, scattering leaves and debris everywhere. Nahas came in to help move a heavy wooden chest that had slid across the room. As they lifted it, a small, battered tin box that had been tucked behind it fell open. Papers spilled out onto the floor. Nahas knelt to pick them up. His hand brushed over a yellowed envelope. He recognized the handwriting. It was Lena's, but younger, less formed. It was a draft of a letter she had never sent. His eyes caught a name, Kane. He froze. He picked up the paper. "Since Papa died, things are difficult. The man named Silas Kane came again today. He says Papa owed him money, but Mama says he just wanted the water rights. Papa told me Kane's men were the ones who cut the fence last week, not the Indians. He said Kane would kill a man for an acre of dirt." Nahas read the words twice. He stood up slowly, the paper crumping in his large hand. He looked at Lena, who was sweeping the corner. "Your father," Nahas said, his voice strange. "How did he die?" Lena stopped sweeping. She looked surprised. "He was shot, on the range. The sheriff said it was a raiding party, Comanches." Nahas held out the paper. "No?" Lena walked over and took the letter. She looked at it, confused. "I wrote this, years ago, before he died, when he was fighting with the neighbor." "The neighbor was Silas Kane?" Nahas asked. "Yes, he had the ranch next to ours in the south." Nahas looked out the window, toward the invisible line where the double-bar K lay. The pieces fell into place like the locking mechanism of a rifle. "It was not Comanches," Nahas said, his voice vibrating with a deadly certainty. "We do not cut fences to steal water rights. We steal horses. We steal glory. We do not kill farmers for dirt." He looked at Lena. The tragedy of her life, the loss of her father, the poverty that had driven her to his door was not an accident of fate. It was the work of the same man who was now trying to destroy him. "Silas Kane killed your father," Nahas said. "He used my people as the blame, and now he is doing it again." Lena stared at him, her face draining of color. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The man who had offered her mother a job yesterday was the man who had destroyed their lives. Nahas stepped closer, his hesitation from the cave gone. He reached out and covered her hand with his own. His hand was large, scarred, and warm. "He made you an orphan," Nahas said, his eyes burning with a promise of retribution. "He will not make you a victim again. I swear this." The bond between them, forged in the mud and the storm, hardened into something unbreakable. They were no longer just employers and cooks, or even men and women fighting an attraction. They were allies in a war against a common enemy, and the rising action had just turned into a march toward battle. The morning sun rose over the canyon rim like a bloodshot eye. The air was yellow with dust, suspended in a stillness that felt unnatural, the kind of silence that makes the hair on a man's arms stand up. It was a dry, brittle morning, the earth parched and pleading for a rain that lingered heavily on the horizon but refused to fall. Nahas stood by the corral, his hand resting on the neck of his black stallion. He was not working the horses today. He was watching the trail that snaked down from the northern ridge. He had sent the women to the kitchen early, telling them to stay inside, but he knew walls of pine logs would not stop what was coming. "They are coming," Little Wolf said, standing beside him. The young warrior had painted his face with a single streak of black ash. I count 20 riders, maybe more. Nahas nodded. Keep the men back. Do not fire unless I give the signal. If we shoot first, we give them the war they want. Lena Odell watched from the window of the cabin. She saw the line of riders descending into the valley. They looked like a dark snake winding through the sagebrush. At the head rode Sheriff Briggs, his tin star catching the dull light, and beside him, sitting tall on a chestnut mare, was Silas Kane. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at her mother, who was sitting at the table, gripping a wooden spoon as if it were a club. They are here for us. Mama, Lena said, her voice trembling but low. They are here for the land, Martha replied, her eyes hard. We are just the excuse. The posse rode into the center of the camp. They did not look like lawmen. They looked like hired guns, men with hard faces and loose morals, the kind Silas Kane kept on his payroll to frighten squatters. They fanned out, forming a semicircle around the main yard, their horses stamping nervously in the dust. Sheriff Briggs rode forward. He looked uncomfortable. Sweat stained the brim of his hat. His eyes darted toward the Comanche warriors who stood silently by the lodges, their hands hovering near their knives and rifles. Nahas, the sheriff called out. We are not here for trouble. Nahas stepped forward. He looked unarmed, though Lena knew he carried a knife at the small of his back. He looked at the sheriff, then at Kane. You bring 20 guns to a peace talk, Sheriff, Nahas asked, his voice calm, carrying easily across the clearing. That is a lot of trouble for a friendly visit. We are here to uphold the law, Briggs said, clearing his throat. We have received reports that you are holding 2 white women against their will. Slave labor. We are here to rescue them. Silas Kane smiled. It was a tight, predatory smile. Bring them out, Comanche, and maybe we will not burn this place to the ground for your insolence. Nahas did not move. They are in the kitchen, where they work, because I pay them. Pay them, Kane laughed, a harsh, barking sound. With what beads and dried meat, do not insult us. Bring out the women. The door of the cabin creaked open. The silence in the clearing stretched thin as wire. Lena stepped out onto the porch. She wore her flour-dusted apron over her faded dress. She looked at the line of men, at the guns, at the sneering face of Silas Kane. She felt the familiar urge to shrink, to hide her bulk, to apologize for taking up space. But then she looked at Nahas. He stood alone in the dirt, a giant of a man facing a firing squad, and he had not taken a single step backward. Lena straightened her spine. She stepped off the porch, her heavy boots thudding on the hard earth. Martha followed her, pale but determined. Lena walked past the sheriff. She walked past Kane. She walked until she stood right beside Nahas. She was nearly as tall as he was, her shoulder brushing his arm. It was a physical declaration of allegiance that shocked the posse more than a gunshot would have. Mrs. Odell, the sheriff said, sounding relieved. Miss Lena, grab your things. You are safe now. We are taking you back to town. No, Lena said. The word hung in the air. Excuse me, the sheriff blinked. I said no, Lena repeated, her voice gaining strength. She looked at the men on the horses, men who had laughed at her in the street, men who had made bets on her weight. I am not a slave. I am a cook. I earn $25 a month. I have a roof. I have respect, which is more than I ever got in Dust Creek. She looked directly at Silas Kane. We are not going anywhere with you. Kane's face flushed a deep, angry red. His narrative was crumbling. The victim was refusing to be saved. You stupid girl, Kane spat. You have been brainwashed, or maybe you just like living in the dirt with a savage because he is the only one desperate enough to look at you. Nahas took a step forward, his body coiling like a spring. But Lena put a hand on his arm. She held him back. I stand here because I choose to, Lena said, her voice ringing out. And I would rather stand in the dirt with an honest man than in a mansion with a liar. Kane's eyes narrowed to slits. He pulled a revolver from his holster, not pointing it at Lena, but waving it toward the camp. Honest. You call this murderer honest? He killed your father, girl, or have you forgotten that? He turned to the posse, raising his voice. This man led the raid that killed Jeremiah Odell. He burned their ranch, and now he holds the daughter as a trophy. Are we going to let that stand? A murmur of anger rippled through the hired guns. This was the story they needed to justify the violence they wanted to commit. Liar! The shout came from Nahas. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled, yellowed letter they had found. Jeremiah Odell was not killed by arrows, Nahas roared. He was shot in the back with a Winchester rifle, .44 caliber, the same rifles your men carry. Cain. Nahas threw the letter onto the ground in front of the sheriff's horse. Read it. Briggs. The girl wrote it years ago. Her father told her that Cain's men cut his fences. That Cain threatened him for the water rights. Silas Cain killed her father to take his land, just as he is trying to kill me to take this valley. Sheriff Briggs looked down at the paper fluttering in the dust. Doubt crossed his face. He looked at Cain. Silas, is this true? It is an Indian lie, Cain screamed. He was losing control. The composure of the wealthy rancher was cracking, revealing the desperate thug beneath. He is trying to trick you. Kill him. Kill them all. The tension snapped. One of Cain's men, a nervous drifter with an itchy finger, saw a young Comanche warrior shift his grip on a rifle. The drifter panicked. He fired. Bang! The shot went wide. It missed the warrior, but it struck a kerosene barrel that stood next to the blacksmithing forge Nahas had built near the barn. The barrel exploded. A ball of orange fire erupted, throwing a wave of heat across the clearing. The burning oil sprayed onto the dry yellow grass that lined the valley floor. The wind, which had been waiting for this moment, caught the flames. In seconds, the fire was not a localized accident. It was a living thing. It raced up the side of the barn. It licked at the legs of the horses. It roared through the sagebrush toward the slopes of the canyon. Fire! Someone screamed. Chaos descended. The horses of the posse reared, terrified by the explosion and the sudden wall of heat. The gunmen forgot about the Comanche. They were fighting to keep their mounts under control. Hold the line, Cain shouted, but no one was listening. The Comanche warriors did not attack the white men. They turned to fight the real enemy. They ran toward the corral, trying to cut the ropes and free the panic-stricken horses before the barn went up. The water, Nahas shouted to his men. Soak the blankets. Cover the lodge. He turned to Lena. Get to the creek. Take your mother. No, Lena shouted over the roar of the flames. She pointed toward the burning barn. The boy. Little Hawk is in there. The heavy timber beam above the barn door, weakened by the fire, groaned and crashed down. It fell across the entrance, trapping 3 horses and the small boy who had been hiding in the hayloft and had tried to run out. The beam was massive, a solid trunk of oak, burning at one end. Nahas sprinted toward it, but the heat was intense. He grabbed the wood, his gloves smoking, and tried to lift. It would not move. It was too heavy for one man, even a giant. Then Lena was there. She did not hesitate. She did not think about the flames singing her eyebrows or the smoke choking her lungs. She threw her shoulder under the unburnt end of the beam. Lift, she screamed. She drove her legs into the earth. Her large frame, the weight that had been her shame, became her leverage. Her thick arms, the muscles that had needed 1,000 loaves of bread, locked into place. She roared, a primal sound of effort that matched the fury of the fire. Nahas lifted her. Together, the warrior and the cook, they heaved the massive timber upward. Run! Nahas shouted to the boy. Little Hawk scrambled out from under the fiery arch, coughing, his eyes wide with terror. The horses followed, stampeding past them into the smoke. The beam crashed back down, sending a shower of sparks over them. Lena stumbled back, gasping. Her apron was singed, her face smeared with soot. She looked at Nahas, and in the hellish light of the fire, he looked at her not as a woman to be protected, but as a titan. But the battle was not over. Through the smoke, a figure emerged, Silas Cain. He had dismounted. His hat was gone. His fine suit was covered in ash. He held a revolver in his hand. His eyes were wild, completely divorced from sanity. He had lost the narrative. He was losing the land to the fire, and now he wanted only blood. "You ruin everything!" Cain screamed. He raised the gun, aiming directly at Nahas's chest. "This is my valley mine." "Drop the gun! Silas!" Sheriff Briggs yelled from somewhere in the smoke. But he did not shoot. He was paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. Nahas did not have a weapon in his hand. He had dropped his knife to lift the beam. He was 10 feet away. Cain cocked the hammer. Nahas charged. He moved with the speed of the stampede itself. Cain fired. The bullet grazed Nahas's ribs, a line of red opening up on his shirt, but it did not stop him. Nahas slammed into Cain. The impact knocked the breath out of the smaller man. They crashed into the dirt, rolling toward the perimeter of the burning fence line. Cain was fighting like a cornered rat, biting, clawing, trying to bring the gun around. Nahas was fighting with the cold fury of a judge delivering a sentence. He gripped Cain's wrist, forcing the gun away. "You killed an honest man for this dirt," Nahas growled, slamming Cain's hand against a rock. "Now taste it!" Cain screamed. He lashed out with his legs, kicking Nahas in the wound. Nahas flinched, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Cain scrambled backward, trying to regain his footing. He backed right into the remains of the dry brush fence, which was now a wall of fire. He panicked. He flailed, the gun still in his hand. In his terror and confusion, as he tried to ward off the heat and aim at Nahas simultaneously, his finger jerked on the trigger. Bang! The shot was muffled by the roar of the fire. Silas Cain stiffened. He looked down at his own stomach, where a dark stain was spreading rapidly. He looked at Nahas with an expression of utter bewilderment. Then, his knees buckled. He fell backward, disappearing into the curtain of smoke and flame that he had ordered his men to ignite. Nahas stood up, breathing hard, holding his side. He watched the fire consume the space where his enemy had stood. There was no triumph in his face, only the weary resignation of survival. Then, the sky broke. It started as a low rumble, deeper than the fire. Then came the wind, cold and wet, and finally, the rain. It fell in sheets, a deluge typical of the high plain storms. It hissed as it hit the fire, turning the orange flames into billowing clouds of white steam. It soaked the combatants, cooling the anger and the heat alike. The fire sputtered and died, leaving behind blackened earth and smoking ruins. Sheriff Briggs sat on his horse, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked around the clearing. He saw the Comanche warriors, who had not killed his deputies but had instead focused on saving the horses. He saw his own men, shamed and lowered, holstering their guns, and he saw the center of the camp. There, in the mud and the ash, sat Lena Odell. She was holding the Comanche boy, Little Hawk, rocking him back and forth. Her face was black with soot. Her hair was a wet, tangled mess, and her dress was ruined. Standing over her, with one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, was Nahas. He was bleeding, exhausted, and magnificent. The sheriff realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that he had been on the wrong side of everything. The savage was not the man with the long hair. The savage was the man burning in the brush. He rode slowly toward them. He looked at Nahas, then at Lena. "The fire is out," the sheriff said, his voice rough. Nahas looked at him, his dark eyes unyielding. "The fire is out. Sheriff, take your men, take the body of your friend, and leave my valley." Briggs nodded slowly. He tipped his hat to Lena, a gesture of genuine respect this time, devoid of mockery. "I will see to it," Briggs said. "And Mrs. Odell, Miss Lena, nobody's going to move you from here unless you want to go." He turned his horse and signaled to the posse. "Let's go. We have a body to retrieve." As the white men rode away, dragging the muddy remains of their crusade behind them, Lena looked up at Nahas. The rain washed the soot from his face, mixing with the blood on his side. "You are bleeding," she said softly. "It is a scratch," Nahas said. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. His hand was strong and steady. "You lifted the mountain today, Lena." "We lifted it," she corrected him. She looked around at the charred barn. The smoking fences, the muddy, ruined camp. It was a disaster scene. But as she looked at the people, her mother checking on the other women, the warriors gathering the horses, she realized that nothing essential had been lost. The fire had burned away the lies. All that was left was the truth. Standing solid and unbreakable in the rain that had quenched the fire eventually slowed to a persistent, weeping drizzle, turning the red dust of the valley into a slick, copper-colored mud. The air smelled heavily of wet charcoal, ozone, and the musk of frightened horses. It was the morning after the battle. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind the throbbing ache of bruises and the stark reality of the damage. Nahas walked the perimeter of the camp, his boots sinking deep into the mire. His side was bandaged with strips of clean cotton that Martha had boiled. The bullet grazed burning with a dull heat, but he barely felt it. He was counting the cost. The barn was gone. It was now a skeletal ruin of blackened timbers jutting into the gray sky like broken teeth. The winter hay supply was ash. 3 horses had died, 2 in the stampede, 1 from a stray bullet. One of them a young warrior's. Runs with wind. Sat by the fire with his arm in a sling, his face pale but stoic. Yet, as Nahas looked toward the center of the camp, he saw what remained. The main lodges were untouched. The cabin, though stained with soot, stood solid. The kitchen lean-to, the heart of the camp's new life, was intact. And most importantly, the people were alive. Silas Kane lay under a canvas tarp near the creek, awaiting the wagon that would take him back to the earth he had tried so violently to steal. His gunmen had fled into the night, their courage dissolving the moment their paymaster fell. Sheriff Briggs had stayed. He had spent the night huddled under the overhang of the blacksmith's shed, watching the Comanches move through the wreckage with efficient silence. He had seen them tend to the horses first, then the women, then themselves. It was a quiet dignity that shamed him more than any sermon. Now, as the sun tried to break through the low clouds, Briggs approached Nahas. The sheriff looked older than he had yesterday. The bluster was gone, replaced by a weary solemnity. "I have written the preliminary report," Briggs said, holding up a leather-bound notebook protected from the damp. He did not meet Nahas's eyes at first, staring instead at the charred remains of the fence. "And what does the white man's paper say?" Nahas asked. Leaning against a fence post, Briggs looked up. "It says that Silas Kane, accompanied by a group of armed deputized citizens, entered the land of Nahas, a land legally recognized by the Treaty of 1874, with the intent to incite violence. It says that Kane initiated the hostilities. It says that he died by his own hand in the chaotic circumstances he created." Nahas nodded slowly. It was the truth. It was a rare thing to hear from a man with a tin star. "And the women?" Nahas asked. Briggs turned to look at the cabin. Martha was on the porch, sweeping ash from the planks. Lena was nowhere to be seen, likely resting inside. "The report states that Mrs. Martha Odell and Miss Lena Odell are employed residents of this ranch," Briggs said firmly. "It states that they are here of their own free will and are under the protection of the property owner. I will make it clear to the town council. Nahas, nobody is going to use them as an excuse for a raid again. If anyone asks, I will tell them that those 2 women have more grit than half the men in Dust Creek combined." "Good," Nahas said. "Then take the body, and tell the town that the valley is closed to visitors until the grass grows back." Briggs signaled to his 2 remaining deputies to load Kane's body onto a pack mule. Before he mounted his horse, he paused. "I misjudged you, Nahas, and I misjudged the girl. I am sorry for that. The rain washes away the dust." "Sheriff," Nahas said, turning back to his work. "But it takes time to wash away the memory." The departure of the lawmen changed the atmosphere in the camp. The tension that had held the warriors taut as bowstrings finally snapped, releasing a collective breath. The community began to emerge from the shelters. The women of the tribe, who had kept the children hidden in the deepest caves during the fight, returned to the central fire. They looked at the blackened ground, then at the white women's cabin. In the past, the divide between the teepees and the cabin had been a polite distance. bridged only by food. Now, the distance had vanished in the smoke. Lena sat on a low stool inside the cabin, wincing as Martha applied a salve of bear grease and crushed herbs to her shoulder. The skin was angry red, blistered where the heat of the burning beam had seared through her dress. "Hold still," Martha murmured, her hands shaking slightly. "It is a bad one. Lena, it will hurt." "I do not mind," Lena said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "It matches the rest of me, rough and unfinished." "Hush," Martha said sharply. She stopped working and moved around to face her daughter. She took Lena's face in her hands, forcing her to look up. For 20 years, Martha had looked at her daughter with a mixture of fierce love and secret apology. She had apologized with her eyes for Lena's size, for her lack of prospects, for the cruelty of the world. She had tried to make Lena smaller, quieter, hoping to shield her from the ridicule. "You listen to me," Martha said, her voice thickening with tears. "Yesterday, I saw you lift a piece of timber that 2 men could not move. I saw you shield a child with your own body while fire rained down. I have spent my life worrying that you were too heavy for this world, that you would break the floorboards." Martha kissed Lena's forehead, right on the smudge of soot that refused to wash away. "But yesterday, I realized something. You are not too heavy. Lena, you are just strong. I have never seen you look so beautiful as when you were holding up that burning wood. You looked like a queen." Lena's eyes filled with tears. She had waited a lifetime to hear those words. Not that she was pretty, she knew she wasn't, but that her body, her formidable, imposing body, was a thing of value. There was a knock on the doorframe. Greystone stood there. The old Comanche elder was leaning on his staff, his long gray braids wrapped in otter fur. Behind him stood Little Hawk, the boy Lena had saved, and his mother, a woman named Singing Grass. "We may enter?" Greystone asked. "Please," Martha said, wiping her eyes and stepping back. Greystone stepped into the cabin. He looked at Lena's bandaged shoulder. He nodded, a gesture of deep acknowledgement. "The young men talk," Greystone said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on rock. "They say the white cook has the spirit of a bear. They say she walks through fire." Singing Grass stepped forward. She did not speak English well. She simply took Lena's large hand in her own 2 small ones and pressed it against her forehead. Then, she placed something in Lena's palm. It was a necklace. It was not made of gold or silver, but of leather strips, intricate beadwork in blue and white, and a single, polished claw of a hawk. "For the one who protects the nest," Greystone translated. "You are no longer a stranger in the camp. Lena Odell, you have bled on this ground. You have swallowed the smoke. You are in the valley now." Lena closed her fingers around the necklace. It felt warm. "Thank you," she whispered. I am honored." "Wear it," Greystone commanded gently, "so the spirits know you are not just a guest." As they left, Lena fastened the leather strap around her neck. The hawk claw rested against her collarbone, a stark contrast to her pale skin. But it felt right. It felt like armor. That evening, the clouds finally broke, revealing a moon that bathed the valley in a silver light that softened the scars of the fire. Nahas found Lena sitting on the ridge overlooking the camp. It was a high spot, a shelf of rock where the wind was constant. She was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching the faint glow of the fires below. He climbed up to join her. He moved stiffly, his side favoring the wound, but his strength was returning. He stood beside her for a long time in silence, listening to the crickets that had already resumed their song, indifferent to the violence of men. "The smell is getting better," Lena said, not looking at him. "The wind cleans everything," Nahas replied. He sat down on a flat rock near her, his legs stretching out. "How is the shoulder?" "It burns," she admitted, "but the pain reminds me that I am alive." Nahas looked at her profile. The moon highlighted the strong curve of her jaw, the fullness of her lips. He thought about the moment in the cave, the heat of her against him. He thought about the moment in the fire, the power of her lifting the beam. "I saw you today," Nahas said quietly. "With the necklace." Lena touched the claw at her throat. Greystone gave it to me. He said I am no longer a stranger. She turned to look at him, her blue eyes searching his face. Do you believe that, Nahas? Or am I still just the white woman you hired because you had no choice? I had a choice, Nahas said. I could have hired a man. I could have hired no one and eaten dried meat until I died. I chose you. You hired a cook, Lena reminded him, her voice trembling slightly. You made it very clear, only to cook. That is what you said. I was a fool, Nahas said. The admission was simple, stripped of all pride. I thought I could draw a line in the dirt. On one side, the work. On the other side, the heart. I thought if I kept you in the kitchen, I would be safe. Safe from what? Lena asked. From wanting you, Nahas said. The wind gusted, whipping a strand of hair across Lena's face. She brushed it away, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must hear it. Why would you want me? She whispered. The old insecurity, the voice of the town, rose up one last time. Look at me, Nahas, I am too much flesh, too much noise, too much trouble. I take up the whole room. Men like Silas Kane, they laugh at me. Men like you are supposed to want someone graceful, someone small. Nahas reached out. He took her hand. His grip was large enough to encompass hers completely. Stand up, he said. Lena hesitated, then stood. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She stood there in her simple dress, feeling huge and vulnerable under the moonlight. Nahas stood as well. He stepped close to her, so close that the heat of his body radiated against hers. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs brushing the line of her neck. Look at this valley, Nahas said, gesturing with his head to the vast, open expanse of darkness and silver below them. Look at the mountains. Look at the sky. It goes on forever. He looked back into her eyes. You say you are too much, too big. I say you have been living in small rooms. You have been trying to fit into a world built for small minds and small hearts. He slid his hands down her arms, feeling the solidity of her muscles, the warmth of her skin. You were never too much. Lena, their world was just too small to hold you. But this valley, it is wide enough. This sky, it is high enough. And my arms. He pulled her against him, deliberate and slow, letting her feel every inch of the contact. My arms are long enough. Lena let out a sob that was half laugh, half cry. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling the scent of rain, leather, and the man who had finally seen her. I was so afraid, she mumbled into his shirt. Afraid that if I let myself hope, I would be destroyed. We have walked through fire. Nahas murmured into her hair. We have been destroyed, and we have been built again. That is the way of the land. He pulled back slightly to look at her. But there is one thing, the tribe. My people. Lena stiffened. What about them? You asked if they would accept you, Nahas said. They saw you in the fire. Lena, they saw you bleed for their children. Comanches do not judge a warrior by the size of their waist. They judge by the size of their courage. You are not a white woman to them anymore. You are the woman who held up the sky so the boy could live. They will not just accept you, they will honor you. Lena nodded, the tears flowing freely now. Then I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere. Good, Nahas said, because I'm tired of eating alone. He kissed her then. It was not a kiss of desperation, like the moment in the cave. It was a kiss of arrival. It was deep, slow, and grounded, tasting of the future. The next morning, the work of rebuilding began. The sound of hammers echoed off the canyon walls as the warriors and the hired hands began to clear the debris of the barn. Martha found Nahas near the creek, washing the soot from his face. She stood on the bank, her hands folded under her apron. Mr. Nahas, she said. Nahas straightened up, wiping his face with a rag. Martha, I saw you on the ridge last night, Martha said. She was direct. She did not have time for games. With my daughter. Nahas did not look away. I will not apologize for it. I did not ask you to, Martha said. She looked at the water flowing over the stones. I have dragged that girl across 3 territories. I have worked hard for her. I have protected her from men who wanted to use her and men who wanted to mock her. I have been her shield." She turned her sharp gaze on him. "But I am getting old, Nahas, and I cannot shield her forever. Yesterday, I saw that she does not need a shield anymore. She needs a partner." Nahas nodded respectfully. "She is strong, Martha, stronger than me in some ways." "She is," Martha agreed, "but she is also tender. Her heart bruises easier than her skin. So I am telling you this. If you are keeping her here, let it be for a home. Not just a kitchen, not just a bed, a home. She needs a place to belong." "I intend to give her that," Nahas said solemnly. "And you as well. Martha, you are the grandmother of this camp. We need you." Martha snorted, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Well, someone has to make sure you don't put too much chili in the stew." She started to walk back to the cabin, then stopped. "And Nahas' respect. That is all I ask." "You have it," Nahas promised. "Always." Later that afternoon, Nahas walked Lena to a spot of flat ground near the edge of the cottonwood grove, slightly apart from the main circle of teepees, but close enough to hear the drum. He had a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of smooth bark in his hand. "What is this?" Lena asked, shading her eyes against the sun. "The barn must be rebuilt," Nahas said. "But the cabin is too small. It leaks. It is a box for sleeping, not for living." He knelt down and began to draw on the bark. "I am thinking of a new house, here, facing the east, to catch the morning sun as my people do, but built of stone and timber, like the houses of your people." He looked up at her. "A big room for the fire, a room for Martha, a room for us." Lena looked at the drawing. It was rough, but she could see the vision. It was a hybrid. It was not fully Comanche, and it was not fully white. It was something new, born of the valley. "It needs a big kitchen," Lena said, pointing to the sketch, "with a window that looks out at the horses." "A big kitchen," Nahas agreed, adding a line, "and a porch for watching the storms." "And a table," Lena added softly. "A table big enough for everyone. For Little Wolf, for Gray Stone, for my mother. No more eating on logs." "A table," Nahas smiled, the expression changing his whole face, making him look 10 years younger. "We will build a table so long we will have to shout to be heard from one end to the other." They stood there, the giant warrior and the large woman, planning a structure that would defy the architecture of the territory. Around them, the camp was busy with the sounds of recovery. The fear had gone. The grief for the dead remained. But it was a clean grief, not the festering wound of oppression. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the grass that was already pushing up through the blackened patches of earth. The falling action was coming to a close, settling the dust, arranging the stones, and preparing the foundation for the final resolution. Lena looked at the spot where her new kitchen would be. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of the valley. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like she was holding her breath, waiting for permission to exist. She was here. She was solid. And she was home. It took 3 weeks for the earth to forgive the fire. The rain had done its work, soaking deep into the scorched soil, turning the black scars of the valley into a bed for new life, where the grass had been burned down to the root. Tiny shoots of vibrant green were beginning to push through the ash. It was a tentative green, the color of hope, reclaiming the land inch by inch. Lena Odell walked toward the creek, a wooden bucket swinging from her hand. The bandages were gone from her shoulder, leaving behind a patch of pink, tender skin that would eventually turn into a silver scar. She did not hide it. She wore her collar open enough to let the air touch it, a badge of the night she had held up the sky. She reached the stone well that Nahas had reinforced near the water's edge. The ground here had been trampled by the panicked horses during the stampede, churned into mud and chaos. But now, it was settling. Something caught her eye near the base of the stones. It was a splash of color against the brown and black earth. A single wildflower, small and stubborn, had bloomed. It was a prairie verbena, its petals a deep, royal purple with a center of bright white. It grew right out of a crack in the rock, defying the drought, defying the fire, defying the hooves that had thundered over it. Lena set the bucket down. She knelt in the dirt, her large skirt pooling around her like a cloud. She reached out and touched the petals with a finger roughened by work. It felt velvety and alive. She snapped the stem carefully. When she returned to the main yard, the air was filled with the sounds of construction. The rhythm of the camp had changed. It was no longer the quiet, guarded silence of a fortress. It was the loud, chaotic, cheerful noise of a village raising itself from the dust. Nahas was near the corral, instructing 2 young men, one Comanche, one a freckle-faced boy from town, on how to set a fence post. He wore a new shirt, stitched by Martha, but his old leather leggings. He looked up as Lena approached. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. He looked tired, but it was the good tiredness of building, not the exhausting vigilance of war. "Water?" Nahas asked, eyeing the bucket. "For the soup," Lena said. She stepped closer, ignoring the way the young men watched them with respectful curiosity. She held out her hand. "Look." Nahas looked down at the small purple flower resting in her palm, against her pale skin. It looked fragile. Against his calloused hand as he took it, it looked precious. "It was growing by the well," Lena said softly, "right where the fire was hottest. It survived the heat. It survived the crushing weight." Nahas twirled the flower between his thumb and forefinger. He looked at the delicate petals. Then he looked up at the woman standing before him. He saw the strength in her jaw, the clarity in her blue eyes, the way she stood tall and unapologetic in the morning light. "It is a tough thing," Nahas murmured, "to come back from the fire and still bloom." Lena smiled. It was not the shy, apologetic smile of the girl who had arrived in the wagon months ago. It was a full, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "So am I," she said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a mountain. She was confirming what the fire had taught her. She was done hiding. She was done apologizing for her existence. She had walked through the inferno and come out the other side, not as ash, but as iron. Nahas placed the flower gently behind her ear, the purple vivid against her wheat-colored hair. "Yes," he said, his voice rumbling with pride. "So you are." The heart of the camp had always been the fire, but now the heart was the kitchen. It was no longer just a lean-to attached to a bachelor's cabin. In the weeks following the fire, Nahas and the men had expanded it. They had built 3 solid walls of stone and timber, enclosing a space that was large enough to feed an army. It was a room of 2 worlds. On one side, a large iron stove ordered all the way from St. Louis and hauled up by 4 mules radiated heat. On the other side, a traditional stone hearth burned with cedar wood, supporting the heavy iron pots of the Comanche style. The smell that wafted from the open windows was a revolution. It was the scent of roasted venison mingling with yeast rolls. It was the smell of sage and chili peppers mixing with apple pie. Lena stood at the center of it all, a conductor of this culinary orchestra. She was rolling out dough for tortillas, her arms moving with practiced rhythm. But she was not alone. Singing Grass and 2 other Comanche women were there, their hands covered in flour, laughing as they tried to master the art of the flaky biscuit. Martha Odell stood by the stove, stirring a massive pot of stew, barking orders in a mixture of English and broken Comanche words she had picked up. "No, no," Martha chided gently, taking a bowl from a young girl. "More thyme, less salt. We want to taste the deer, not the ocean." The girl giggled and reached for the herb jar. Lena watched them. She saw her mother, who had been so afraid of this wild place, now teaching a grandmother how to thicken gravy. She saw the women who had once looked at her with suspicion now nudging her with their elbows, sharing jokes that needed no translation. "The bread rises," Singing Grass said, pointing to the loaves sitting near the warmth of the hearth. "It rises," Lena agreed, wiping her hands on her apron. "We will need more. The boys from town are eating like wolves." That was the other change. The social landscape of the valley was shifting, slow as a glacier, but just as unstoppable. Dust Creek was a town of hard edges and poverty. When the news spread that Nahas were rebuilding and paying fair wages in silver coins, the desperation of the poor white families outweighed their prejudice. Fathers sent their sons. Then, seeing that the sons returned fed and paid, they came themselves. Now, in the yard, a group of children were playing a game of tag that spanned cultures. Little Hawk was chasing a boy named Billy, the son of the blacksmith. They were screaming in a language that was half English, half Comanche, and fully childish joy. They ran past the kitchen window, skidding to a halt as the smell of fresh bread hit them. "Miss Lena," Billy shouted. "Is it ready?" "5 minutes," Lena called back. "And wash your hands, all of you. I do not care if you are red or white. Dirt tastes the same." Nahas watched this from the door of the barn. He saw the children. He saw the men working side by side on the roof. He saw the way the fear had evaporated, replaced by the pragmatic cooperation of survival. Sheriff Briggs rode into the yard just before noon. He did not bring a posse this time. He brought a leather satchel. He dismounted and walked to where Nahas stood. The sheriff looked at the bustling activity, at the mixed group of workers, and shook his head in wonder. "If you had told me 6 months ago that I would see this," Briggs said, "I would have called you a liar and a dreamer. Hunger brings men together." "Sheriff," Nahas said, "and good bread keeps them there." Briggs chuckled. He opened his satchel and pulled out a document stamped with the official seal of the territorial governor. "This came yesterday," Briggs said, handing it to Nahas. "It is the final survey. The boundary lines are drawn. This valley, from the North Ridge to the creek, is registered. It is yours. Nahas, free and clear. No more disputes about grazing rights. No more questions about who owns the water." Nahas took the paper. It was light, just a piece of dried pulp and ink, but it felt heavier than a rifle. It was security. It was a shield that Silas Kane could never break. "And," Briggs added, looking toward the kitchen where Lena was pulling loaves from the oven, "I took the liberty of adding the names of Mrs. Odell and her daughter to the residency permit. They are officially recognized as tenants with full legal standing. Anyone who wants to bother them answers to the territory." Nahas looked at the sheriff. "You did not have to do that." "Yes," Briggs said, adjusting his hat. "I did. That girl, she saved us all from a lot of blood. Nahas, it is the least the law can do." Briggs walked over to the kitchen window. Lena appeared, her face flushed from the heat. "Sheriff," she nodded. "Miss Lena." Briggs tipped his hat. "Smells good enough to arrest a man for stealing a sniff." Lena laughed, a full, throaty sound. She broke a hot roll in half, buttered it quickly, and handed it through the window. "On the house, Sheriff, but only if you tell the town that the giant Comanche pays his debts." "I will tell them," Briggs promised, taking a bite. "I will tell them indeed." The sun began its descent, painting the western sky in strokes of violet and burning orange. The work of the day was done. The hammers were silent. The horses were fed and watered. Nahas found Lena in the kitchen, wiping down the big oak table. Martha had already retired to the back room, claiming her knees were complaining about the rain that was coming next week. "Leave the flour," Nahas said from the doorway. "It will be there tomorrow." Lena looked up. "A clean table brings good dreams. That is what my grandmother said." "A walk brings better ones," Nahas countered. He held out a heavy buffalo robe. Lena smiled, untied her apron, and hung it on the peg. They walked up the path to the high ridge, the spot that had become their sanctuary. The air was cooling rapidly, the desert heat vanishing with the sun. They stood on the precipice, looking down at the valley. The fires of the camp were lit, glowing like fallen stars. The new roof of the barn reflected the moonlight. It was a kingdom, not of gold, but of peace. Nahas unfolded the buffalo robe. He stepped behind Lena and swung it around her shoulders. But he did not let go. He wrapped the ends around her, then stepped in close, pulling the robe and her against him. They stood there, two large people wrapped in a single skin, a silhouette against the vastness of the darkening sky. "It is quiet," Lena whispered, leaning back into his warmth. "It is," Nahas agreed. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "I have been thinking, Lena, that is dangerous," she teased gently. "About the day you came." He continued, his voice serious. "The day I stood in the street and hired you." Lena stiffened slightly, remembering the shame of that day, the jeers of the crowd. "I looked at you," Nahas said, his arms tightening around her, "and I saw a cook. I saw strong hands. I saw a woman who could lift a sack of grain. That was all I saw." He turned her around so that she faced him, keeping the robe cocooned around them both. He looked down into her face, his dark eyes searching hers. "I told myself, here is a woman who will work. She will feed the men. She will wash the clothes. And she will be safe because I will not look at her as anything else." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "I was arrogant. I thought I could command my heart like I command a horse." He reached up and touched the side of her face. "I never meant to fall for my daughter. Lena, I only wanted soup. I did not think my heart would be tortured by the sound of a woman humming in my kitchen. I did not think I would be willing to burn down the world just to keep a scratch off her skin." Lena looked at him, tears pricking her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "You are a terrible planner, Nahas," she whispered, a laugh bubbling up through her emotion. "You hired a cook, and you got this." She gestured to herself. "All of this trouble, all of this noise. I got a life," Nahas corrected her. "I got a home." "And I," Lena said, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under the cotton shirt. "I thought I was hired to be invisible. I thought I would hide in your canyon until I died." She looked up at him, her gaze fierce and loving. "You did not intend to love the fat girl, Nahas, but you did. And she did not intend to love the savage, but she does." The words hung in the air, absolute and binding. Nahas lowered his head. He did not kiss her with the desperate hunger of the cave, nor the frantic relief of the fire. He kissed her slowly. It was a kiss of deep, abiding recognition. It was a kiss that tasted of smoke and sage, of bread and rain. It was a kiss that said, "You are my shelter." His large hands cupped her face, treating her as if she were something fragile and priceless, yet knowing she was as strong as the earth beneath their feet. Lena melted into him, her arms going around his neck, pulling him closer. For a moment, there was no Comanche and no white woman. There was no giant and no big Lena. They were just two souls who had found the one place in the world where they fit perfectly. When they finally broke apart, the moon was high. "We have work to do," Nahas said, though he made no move to leave the warmth of the blanket. "The herd needs to be moved to the south pasture next week. I want to buy 20 more mares from the territory breeder." "And the school," Lena said. "School?" Nahas raised an eyebrow. "The children," Lena said firmly. "Little Hawk, Billy, the others, they are running wild. They need to read. They need to write." "I do not want them sent to the mission schools," Nahas said, his voice hardening. "They cut the boys' hair. They forbid the language." "No," Lena shook her head. "Here, in the kitchen, in the afternoons." She looked at the camp below. "I will teach them English. Singing Grass can teach them Comanche. I will teach them to read the treaties so they are never cheated. And I will teach them to bake." "To bake," Nahas chuckled. "Baking is chemistry," Lena said seriously. "And it is diplomacy. It is hard to hate someone when your mouth is full of warm tortillas. We will make a kitchen where there are no borders, Nahas, where English and Comanche mix like flour and water." Nahas looked at her with awe. "You want to change the world with biscuits, Lena Odell." "Not the whole world," Lena said, resting her head on his chest. "Just this valley, just our world. That is enough." The years would pass. The seasons would turn, bringing snow to the high ridges and heat to the canyon floor. The railroad would come closer, bringing more noise, more people, more change. But in the valley of the giant Comanche, time seemed to move differently. Travelers passing through the high country would stop their horses on the ridge and look down. They would see a sprawling ranch, prosperous and green. They would see a house built of stone and timber, with a porch that faced the sunrise. They would see a herd of horses, 100 strong, running across the recovering earth, Appaloosas running beside quarter horses, their saddles a mix of high-horned western leather and Comanche pads. And if they looked closely, against the dying light of the setting sun, they would see 2 figures standing on the porch, a man, tall as a pine tree, his hair braided with silver and leather, and a woman, solid and substantial, standing beside him. They would not be standing apart. They would be wrapped in a single, large buffalo robe, standing so close that from a distance, they looked like one being. They stood like a monument to the impossible. The story of the West is often written in gunpowder and blood. It is written in the tragic fading of a people and the ruthless expansion of another. But in this one small canyon, the story was written differently. It was written with the smell of rising dough. It was written in the sound of children speaking 2 tongues. It was written in the defiance of a warrior and a woman who had been told they were too much and too strange for the world, and who had answered by building a world that was finally big enough to hold them both. They did not conquer the West. They simply loved each other well enough to survive it. Thank you, dear reader, for riding this trail with me to the very end. It has been a long journey from the dusty streets of Dust Creek to the quiet peace of the canyon, and I am grateful you stayed by the campfire to hear the tale of Nahas and Lena. I would love to know where you are listening to this story from. Are you sitting on a porch in Texas, riding a bus in London, or tucked in bed somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. Did Lena and Nahas find the ending you hoped for? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like and hit that hype button so we can share this story of love and resilience with more people around the world. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.